Hey guys, it's been approximately 2 weeks since the last video I made on Flins and Lauma's kit, going over the new character mechanics, artifacts, and weapons in the beta. Now, 2 weeks later, we've got even more information on what these new characters are going to look like and how these new Moonsign mechanics will interact with the characters. For today's video, I'll be going over the overarching changes in the beta, like the Moonsign mechanics or the lunar charge reactions, along with the new buffs and nerfs that happened to Flins and Lauma in the V2 and V3 beta changes. Then I'll be going over some calcs to see how their performances may have changed. Starting off with the overall changes, it seems there has been changes to how the Moonsign buffs work. Whereas previously we thought that the Moonsign buffs from both the Nascent and Ascendant Gleam level stack, it seems like information is coming in stating that they don't actually stack. Obviously this has major repercussions for all of the Nod-Krai characters as kits now, but I'll go over that in their kit section. Apparently we also got information stating that the Moonsign buffs aren't just exclusive to the buffs seen in a Nod-Krai character's kit, but rather they also work like the elemental synergy buffs we get in regular team building. Similarly to how double pyro gives you more attack or double hydro gives you more HP, Moonsign buffs will now increase lunar reaction damage by up to 48% based on what elements your non-Nod-Krai team members are. For example, for every pyro, electro, or cryo non-Nod-Krai character you have on your team, your lunar reaction damage will now increase by 1.2% per every 100 attack, meaning that as long as you have 4000 attack with your non-Nod-Krai pyro, electro, and or cryo characters, you can buff your lunar charge damage by up to 48%. Now if I'm being completely honest, I don't really get how this buff will work. Considering that lunar reactions typically only want crits and EM, I'm assuming these buffs will only work on teams like Overvape, where the lunar charge reaction acts as a secondary source of damage, or in a fridge team, aka a freeze bloom team, where the lunar bloom damage will act as a secondary source of damage to your cryo characters. Now to be fair, you could make lunar bloom your main source of damage still, since dendro characters buff lunar reaction damage based on how much EM they have. Not only that, but hydro characters, especially Nailu, all scale off of HP and are incredibly powerful for lunar reaction based teams, so they too can buff the lunar reaction damage by a substantial amount. Regardless, it seems like these buffs, although powerful, will be tricky to maneuver with non-Nod-Krai cryo, pyro, and electro characters, and will probably encourage odd but viable team combinations with them, while also buffing basic meta lunar reaction based teams. Onto Lauma's kit, it seems like she got a ton of buffs, with her ultimate now increasing lunar bloom damage by 400% rather than 230%, while also increasing bloom, virgin, and hyper bloom damage by 500% rather than 460%. It also seems like her C2 was changed so that now it increases lunar bloom damage by 400% when expending Pale Hymns, aka when using her ultimate, rather than only doing 250%, which is actually a massive boost to her C2. Her C6 was also changed so that now instead of doing an additional 320% of dendro damage with her held attack, now it only does 160, and instead of doing additional dendro damage equal to 280% of her elemental mastery, this additional damage is now only equal to 120% of her elemental mastery, meaning that her C6 got nerfed, which is a shame for anyone else out there, but considering that this is her C6, I'm sure she'll still be broken. She also got a ton of nerfs to her skill, since now her press damage does 218% rather than 148%, and her second hit, hold damage, now does 273% rather than 468%. But she did get a buff to her first hold hit, in which now it does 284% rather than 194%. Now for the Moonsign changes I was talking about, it seems like now if you're only running Lauma and no other Nod-Krai characters, aka if your Moonsign level is of the Nascent Gleam level, she will make it so that Bloom, Hyper Bloom, and Virgin damage dealt by the party members can score crit hits, with the crit rate fixed at 15% and crit damage fixed at 100%, in which these fixed crit stats can stack with Nahida's C2. But if you do use another Nod-Krai member, aka if you raise the Moonsign onto the Ascendant Gleam level, now she will only increase the crit rate and crit damage of Lunar Bloom damage by 10% and 20%, aka she will give her own Lunar Bloom damage that she does through her skill 40% more crit stats, and that's it, meaning that if you want to do insane Hyper Bloom, Bloom, or Virgin damage with her, you'll be forced to only use her and no other Nod-Krai character like Flins, Inefa, Aino, or Columbina, which actually explains why they added those Moonsign buffs to non-Nod-Krai characters. If you think about it, your lunar reaction damage is going to be so bad unless you have other Nod-Krai characters who buff that damage on your team. So obviously they had to incorporate similar levels of buffs that non-Nod-Krai members give to lunar reaction damage, so that lunar reaction damage could actually be a source of secondary damage on teams with no Nod-Krai characters, rather than just straight up being non-existent damage. Regardless, for Flins' kits, even though bro was already facing accusations that he had Inazuma levels of power without Inefa, the developers actually came out here and nerfed him even more. Apparently, he got a decent buff to his normal attacks, since now he has increased interruption resistance. But obviously, even this buff was a troll from the devs, considering that he still desperately needs Inefa, who already gives him a shield. Not only that, but his cutscene ultimate was nerfed, so that now he only does 29% lunar charge damage based on each phase, rather than 46%. The energy cost was also increased from 70 to 80, and the ultimate now has a cooldown of 20 seconds rather than 17 seconds, which apparently is actually a buff to his other ultimate, since now you can collect more energy rather than collecting excess energy. But it's still pretty bad how his really cool cinematic ultimate once again got butchered by his special ultimate. His final phase lunar charge damage also got nerfed from 233% to 210%. His Thundering Symphony damage also got nerfed from 140 to 128%, and his Thundering Symphony additional damage got nerfed from 210% to 187%. Obviously, all of this is pretty annoying, but hey, at least he got a 5% damage increase to his lunar charge reactions at C6. Now for how these Moonsign changes change his kits and performance, it's actually Jover. The V1 kit for Flins made it so that he would only increase his lunar charge damage by an additional 20% if you had another Nod-Krai character on your team, but you'd still be able to make use of all of his other buffs. But for his V3 kits, apparently he doesn't even use the Nascent Gleam level for anything now. You either have another Nod-Krai character on your team, aka Inefa, or you just straight up don't make use of his Moonsign mechanics. Obviously, to combat this, you can always just get another Nod-Krai character on your team like Aino, but come on, the devs aren't even trying to hide it anymore. You either get Inefa, or you do a significant amount of less damage. How much damage, you say? Well, apparently, according to some Sajev calcs, if you don't have Inefa, you do 21% less damage, and if you don't have Lauma as well, you lose out on an additional 10%, equating to over 30% damage lost from not having Lauma and Inefa. Now keep in mind that these calcs were from the V2 beta, meaning that Lauma's damage contribution significantly dropped since she does less damage now, while Inefa's damage contribution has risen since Flins also does less damage now. If we look at some new calcs from the V3 beta done by Vomfi, we see that if you run Flins with Ayansan rather than Inefa, you still lose out on around 30% damage, which becomes obvious when you consider that according to Vomfi, both Flins and Lauma have lost out on 5 to 7% DPS overall because of the recent V3 beta nerfs. Now if we compare these numbers to current characters like Arlecchino, Nuvilette, Skirk, Farisa, Mavuika, or even any DPS Natling character, Flins' DPS, even with Inefa, is incredibly mediocre, since Farisa is able to do around 108k DPS, Skirk around 125k DPS, Mavuika around 140k DPS, and practically every Natling DPS can do around 100k. So for Nod-Krai units, it seems like Flins' damage is pretty subpar, and Lauma's damage is even worse. Now to be fair, chances are that Columbina will probably make both of them absolutely insane, which is why their damage numbers, even before their best support, are standard damage numbers. So if you're hesitant on pulling for them when they release, either because they're dependent on characters that you don't like, or because their numbers just don't seem too high, remember that Columbina will probably solve all of that. That is, if you like Columbina, and if you don't, well then L all the male lovers. Regardless, if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have anything to say, please leave it down in the comments below. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.